Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Stories. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Shadow Beneath the Stairs. In the heart of a quiet town stood the old Hawthorne mansion. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, its once grand windows now shattered, its stone walls cracked and overgrown with ivy. The mansion had a sinister reputation. No one dared to live there. The locals spoke of strange happenings, of lights flickering in the windows at night, and eerie sounds drifting out from beneath the house. But it wasn't just the house itself that frightened people. It was the shadows that seemed to move within it, the ones that lingered even when the sun was high in the sky. Riley was new to the town, having recently moved in with her aunt, who owned a small bookstore on the outskirts. Riley had always been drawn to the mysteries of the unknown, and the Hawthorne mansion was the most intriguing mystery of all. She had heard the whispers at the bookstore, the hushed conversations about the mansion's haunted past. But Riley wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. She was a skeptic, and she was determined to see for herself. One cool autumn evening, when the air was thick with mist and the town was quiet, Riley decided to take a walk. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the streets as she made her way toward the mansion. The road leading to the house was narrow and winding, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on her as she walked. The mansion loomed ahead, dark and silent, like a giant watching her approach. The front gate was rusted and barely hanging on its hinges, but Riley pushed it open with ease. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, and the weeds had overtaken the once pristine garden. But she pressed on, her curiosity outweighing her unease. She reached the front steps, which creaked under her weight as she ascended. The door was ajar, the wood warped with age. It seemed to beckon her inside, and with a deep breath, Riley stepped over the threshold. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of decay heavy in her lungs. The foyer was grand, with a large staircase that spiraled up to the second floor. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their faces obscured by grime. But what caught Riley's attention was the shadow beneath the stairs. It was dark, almost unnatural, like the shadows were moving, stretching and shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Riley hesitated for a moment, her heart skipping a beat, but she quickly shook off the unease. She was here to solve the mystery of the mansion, not to run from it. As she walked deeper into the house, she noticed how still everything was. There was no sound of animals outside, no creak of the house settling. It was as if the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for her. She stepped into the living room, where the furniture had long been covered in dust and cobwebs. The grand piano in the corner stood untouched, its keys yellowed with age. Riley's eyes wandered to the large window that overlooked the garden. It was cracked, but the moonlight still filtered through, casting long, thin beams of light across the room. Suddenly, she heard Ida's soft, scuffling noise from upstairs. Riley's heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. The footsteps were faint, but they were unmistakable. Someone or something was in the house with her. She turned toward the staircase, the shadow beneath it now seeming to deepen, as if something was hiding there, waiting. She slowly ascended the stairs, every creak beneath her feet loud in the silence. The air grew colder the higher she went, and the shadows seemed to stretch further along the walls. Riley's pulse quickened. She was so close now. She had to know what was in the house, what had been waiting here for so long. At the top of the stairs, she was faced with a long hallway, doors lined up on either side. As she walked down the corridor, she felt a strange sensation, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. The air seemed heavier here, suffocating, as though something dark and oppressive had taken root in these very walls. The door at the end of the hall stood ajar, and from within came a low, guttural sound. It was almost like a whisper, but it was distorted, as if something was trying to speak but couldn't quite form words. As she walked deeper into the house, she noticed how still everything was. There was no sound of animals outside, no creak of the house settling. It was as if the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for her. She stepped into the living room, where the furniture had long been covered in dust and cobwebs. The grand piano in the corner stood untouched, its keys yellowed with age. Riley's eyes wandered to the large window that overlooked the garden. It was cracked, but the moonlight still filtered through, casting long, thin beams of light across the room. Suddenly, she heard Ida's soft, scuffling noise from upstairs. Riley's heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. The footsteps were faint, but they were unmistakable. Someone or something was in the house with her. She turned toward the staircase, the shadow beneath it now seeming to deepen, as if something was hiding there, waiting. She slowly ascended the stairs, every creak beneath her feet loud in the silence. The air grew colder the higher she went, and the shadows seemed to stretch further along the walls. Riley's pulse quickened. She was so close now. She had to know what was in the house, what had been waiting here for so long. At the top of the stairs, she was faced with a long hallway, doors lined up on either side. As she walked down the corridor, she felt a strange sensation, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. The air seemed heavier here, suffocating, as though something dark and oppressive had taken root in these very walls. The door at the end of the hall stood ajar, and from within came a low, guttural sound. It was almost like a whisper, but it was distorted, as if something was trying to speak but couldn't quite form words. Story 2. The Forgotten Lighthouse. On the edge of a desolate coastline, battered by relentless winds and crashing waves, stood the Blackwater Lighthouse. It had been abandoned for decades, its lantern long extinguished. Locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed. They spoke of strange lights that flickered in its tower at night, and of shipwrecks where no wrecks should be. Clara, a journalist from the city, had come to Blackwater to uncover the truth. She was drawn by the stories of disappearances and eerie lights. If the lighthouse was haunted, it would make for a sensational article, and Clara was willing to risk her nerves to get to the bottom of it. The townsfolk warned her to stay away. It's not just haunted, one fisherman told her. It's alive. It watches you. It wants you to come inside. Clara dismissed their warnings as superstitions, fueled by years of isolation and fear. One stormy evening, with her camera and notebook in hand, Clara decided to investigate. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and menacing against the stormy sky. The wind howled as she climbed the rocky path, her flashlight flickering in the rain. When she reached the heavy wooden door, she found it slightly ajar, creaking with each gust of wind. She hesitated. The air seemed thicker here, heavy with something she couldn't name. Brushing aside her unease, she pushed the door open. Inside, the lighthouse was colder than the storm outside. The stone walls were damp, and the spiral staircase leading to the top seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Strange markings covered the wall symbols she didn't recognize. She snapped a few photos, the flash momentarily illuminating the gloom. As she climbed the staircase, the air grew colder, and an odd hum began to fill the space. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded almost alive. Each step echoed loudly, but when she paused to listen, she swore she could hear other footsteps, faint and shuffling, somewhere above her. Reaching the top, she entered the lantern room. The massive glass panes were filthy, covered in years of grime, but through the cracks. The storm outside was visible. In the center of the room stood the rusted lantern mechanism. Clara approached it cautiously, her breath visible in the icy air. Suddenly, the lantern flickered to life, casting an eerie green glow across the room. Startled, Clara stumbled backward, nearly dropping her camera. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, and with each pulse, the hum grew louder. Then she heard it a voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it grew stronger. "Help us," it said. A chorus of overlapping voices, male and female, young and old. Clara spun around, shining her flashlight into the corners of the room. There was no one there, but the voices didn't stop. They pleaded, wept, and screamed all at once. Panicked, Clara tried to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The voices grew deafening, and the green light began to seep into the walls, turning them translucent. To her horror, she saw faces, dozens of them pressed against the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. She realized with dawning terror that these were the lost souls, the victims of the lighthouse. Each face seemed to watch her, their eyes filled with despair. "You came," the voices said in unison, now deep and guttural. "You must stay." The room began to spin, the walls closing in. Clara screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the light. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in the glass, her face distorting as it melted into the wall. The next morning, the lighthouse stood silent. The storm had passed, and the skies were clear. But when locals ventured close, they noticed something new, a faint green glow emanating from the lantern. And if you listened closely, you could hear a single voice among the whispers, a woman's voice, calling for help. Clara had become part of the legend, another soul trapped in the lighthouse's eternal grasp. Story 3: The Shadow in the Cellar. At the edge of a small, forgotten town sat the Abernathy estate, a sprawling mansion shrouded in ivy and mystery. It had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, ever since its last owner, Gregory Abernathy, vanished without a trace. The locals whispered about a darkness that lingered in the house, a presence that hungered for the living. Despite the rumors, a young couple, Alex and Mia, purchased the estate. They were drawn to its history and charm. Dismissing the tales as mere superstition, they planned to restore it, imagining it as their dream home. The first few days were uneventful. They cleaned the dusty rooms and marveled at the intricate woodwork and stained glass windows. But beneath the surface, something sinister stirred. On their fourth night in the house, Alex was in the cellar, checking the old foundation. The cellar was massive, its stone walls damp and cold. As he inspected the corners, his flashlight flickered, and he thought he saw something move in the shadows. "Mia," he called, but there was no response. The flashlight steadied, and the shadow was gone. He dismissed it as a trick of the light and went back upstairs. That night, Mia woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall. She nudged Alex awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. They listened, holding their breath. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and heavy. They stopped right outside their bedroom door. Alex grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. Yet the faint scent of earth and decay lingered in the air. The next day, Mia found scratch marks on the cellar door. Deep, jagged lines ran across the wood, as if something with claws had tried to claw its way out. Maybe a raccoon got trapped down there. Alex suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. That evening, as Alex worked in the garden, Mia heard faint whispers coming from the cellar. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Come down," the voice beckoned, low and raspy. Her heart pounded as she approached the cellar door. She pressed her ear against it, and the whispers stopped. Gathering her courage, she opened the door and shined a flashlight into the darkness. The cellar was empty, but the air was unnaturally cold. The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, she saw a figure at the far end of the room, a tall, gaunt shadow with glowing eyes. She slammed the door and ran outside, her breath hitching. Alex found her trembling on the porch. "There's something down there," she insisted. He decided they would investigate together, armed with flashlights and a crowbar. The cellar was silent as they descended the creaking stairs. The air was thick, the shadows deeper than before. At the far end, they found a door they hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind rotting crates. It was old, made of iron, and locked with a rusted chain. "What's behind it?" Mia whispered. Alex pried the chain loose and pushed the door open. Beyond it was a small, circular room. In the center stood a stone well, its edges covered in strange runes. As they approached, a cold gust of air rushed from the well, extinguishing their flashlights. The room plunged into darkness. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the well, followed by a scratching sound, like claws scraping against stone. "Run!" Alex shouted, grabbing Mia's hand. But before they could reach the stairs, the cellar door slammed shut. The scratching grew louder, closer. They turned to see a figure emerging from the well, a monstrous, shadowy being with elongated limbs and a face that was nothing but a gaping maw. It lunged at them, its claws raking the air. They fought to push the cellar door open, finally bursting into the kitchen and slamming it shut behind them. The whispers continued through the night, growing louder and more insistent. The next morning, they left the house, vowing never to return. As they drove away, Mia glanced back and saw the shadowy figure standing in the upstairs window, watching them. The Abernathy estate remains abandoned, but locals say that on quiet nights, you can hear whispers coming from the cellar, calling for anyone brave or foolish enough to answer. Story 4. The room that wasn't there. Deep in the heart of the city stood the Glenwood Apartments, an old, crumbling building with a long history of eccentric tenants and whispered tragedies. The landlord, an aging man named Mr. Carruthers, was known for his curt demeanor and a peculiar rule: stay out of the 11th floor. The elevator didn't even list an 11th button, jumping from 10 to 12. When curious tenants asked about it, Mr. Carruthers would grow pale and mutter, "There is no 11th floor. Forget about it." Emily, a young artist new to the city, moved into Glenwood Apartments on the 5th floor. She loved the building's charm, despite its age, and found Mr. Carruthers' mysterious rule intriguing. One rainy night, as she returned from her studio, the elevator shuddered medicine. The lights flickered, and the buttons blinked erratically. When the doors finally opened, the glowing panel read, 11. Emily frowned. She hadn't pressed the button, and as far as she knew, this floor didn't exist. The hallway ahead was dim, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and faded carpeting. A faint, musty odor hung in the air. Against her better judgment, Emily stepped out. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, with identical doors on either side. The numbers on the doors were strange, not in sequence. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing faintly. No response. As she walked, she noticed that the air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light. She felt watched, though the hallway appeared empty. One door stood ajar, its number scratched away. Unable to resist her curiosity, she pushed it open. Inside was a small, windowless room with a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a weathered notebook. Emily picked it up and flipped through its pages. The entries were frantic, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "They're watching. The walls are alive. I can't get out." Her stomach twisted. She turned the page and saw a crude drawing of a figure tall, faceless shadow with elongated limbs. Beneath it were the words, "Don't look at them." Suddenly, she heard the faint creak of a floorboard behind her. She spun around, but saw nothing. The hallway was silent, too silent. Clutching the notebook, she stepped back into the corridor. The door slammed shut behind her, and the air grew heavier. That's when she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs too long and joints that moved unnaturally. Its face was obscured, but its presence was suffocating. Emily froze, remembering the warning in the notebook. "Don't look at them." She turned away, heart pounding, and began walking back to the elevator. The figure's footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. When she reached the elevator, she slammed the button repeatedly. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She felt its presence right behind her, the air around her turning icy. The elevator doors finally opened, and she stumbled inside, hitting the button for the 5th floor. As the doors closed, she risked a glance behind her. The figure stood inches from her, its shadowy form filling the hallway. For the first time, its face became visibly an empty void of darkness that seemed to pull at her very soul. The doors shut, and the elevator descended. When it reached the 5th floor, Emily stumbled out, gasping for air. She ran to her apartment, locking the door behind her. The next morning, she told Mr. Carruthers what had happened. His face turned ashen. "You saw it," he whispered. "You were on the 11th floor." Emily nodded, handing him the notebook. "What is it? What's up there?" Mr. Carruthers shook his head. "No one knows. That floor, it shouldn't exist. Those who go there are never the same." "Then why does the elevator take people there?" "It doesn't," he said, his voice trembling, "unless it wants you to." Emily packed her belongings and left the Glenwood Apartments that very day. The building remains occupied, but whispers of the 11th floor persist. Tenants claim to hear faint footsteps above them at night, and some swear they've seen shadowy figures in the elevator's reflection. And every so often, the elevator stops at a floor that isn't supposed to be there. Story 5. The Dollmaker's Curse. In a forgotten village nestled in the shadow of a vast forest, there was a crumbling shop called the Dollmaker's Workshop. Its windows were covered in thick grime, and a faded wooden sign swayed ominously in the wind. The villagers avoided it, muttering tales of its last owner, a reclusive craftsman named Elias Grimsby, who had vanished decades ago under mysterious circumstances. Grimsby was no ordinary doll maker. His creations were lifelike, almost too real, with eyes that seemed to follow you and expressions frozen in uncanny perfection. He claimed he used a special technique for his masterpieces, but no one knew what it was. Over time, rumors spread that his dolls were cursed, and after his disappearance, the shop was left to decay, its secrets buried within. When Maria, a struggling antique dealer, stumbled upon the village, she saw the workshop as an opportunity, despite the villagers' warnings. She purchased the property, hoping to uncover valuable relics to sell. The first time she entered the shop, she was overwhelmed by the musty scent of wood and decay. Dust coated every surface, and shelves were lined with dolls of every size and shape. Some were half finished, their porcelain faces cracked or missing eyes. Others were pristine, their lifelike stares unnerving. Maria found an old ledger on the counter, filled with Ilias's notes. Among the sketches of dolls were cryptic passages about a ritual he called the binding. She read aloud, "To grant them life, I must give a piece of myself. They will serve, but they will also hunger. The eyes must never meet for too long, or the soul will wander." She dismissed it as the ramblings of an eccentric artist and focused on cataloging the dolls. That night, she stayed in the shop to begin her work. As the clock struck midnight, Maria heard a faint sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. She froze, listening. The sound grew louder, coming from the shelves where the dolls sat. Their glass eyes seemed to glint in the dim light. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. Uneasy but determined, Maria continued her work. She picked up a particularly beautiful doll, its face painted with delicate precision, and its eyes an unsettling shade of blue. As she examined it, she thought she felt its body grow warmer in her hands. She set it down quickly and turned away. But out of the corner of her eye, she swore she saw its head tilt ever so slightly. The next morning, Maria awoke at her desk, her neck stiff and her mind foggy. She didn't remember falling asleep. The doll she had been examining was now on the counter, facing her. As the days passed, strange things began to happen. Dolls would appear in different parts of the shop, their positions subtly altered. At night, Maria heard whispers, too faint to make out, but unmistakably coming from the shelves. She began to have vivid visions, surrounded by his dolls. In her dreams, he wasn't crafting them, he was pleading with them, begging for forgiveness. One night, unable to shake the growing dread, Maria decided to burn the dolls. She gathered them into a pile in the center of the workshop and lit a match. The moment the flame touched the first doll, a chilling scream pierced the air. The doll's eyes glowed, and their painted lips began to move, forming silent words. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Maria felt a crushing weight on her chest. The pile of dolls began to move, their limbs twitching and jerking. They rose, staggering toward her like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Panicking, Maria stumbled backward and fell, her head hitting the edge of the counter. As her vision blurred, she saw the blue-eyed doll standing over her, its face twisted into a cruel smile. When Maria awoke, she was no longer in the workshop. She was in a small, dark room filled with shelves. On the shelves were dolls, but this time, their faces weren't porcelain, they were human. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She couldn't move. She realized with dawning horror that she wasn't herself anymore. She was one of the dolls. The shop remained silent for months until a new traveler stumbled upon it. Intrigued by the eerie collection, they, too, ignored the villagers' warnings and stepped inside. And so, the cycle continued. The doll-maker's curse claimed another victim, and his lifelike creations remained, waiting for their next soul to join them. Story 6. The House at Black Hollow Lane. On the outskirts of a town that had long since been forgotten by most maps, there was a road called Black Hollow Lane. At the end of that road stood an ancient, decrepit mansion. Its high Gothic spires pierced the sky, and its windows seemed to glimmer with a faint, ghostly light even when the sky was overcast. The locals never ventured near, claiming the house was cursed. They said it was alive, feeding on those foolish enough to step inside. The mansion had been abandoned for nearly a century. Ever since, the Reinhardt family vanished overnight. Theories about their disappearance ranged from occult practices to grisly murders, but nothing concrete was ever proven. Still, the mansion remained, untouched except by time and the creeping vines that wrapped around its walls like skeletal fingers. One rainy evening, a group of college friends, Lana, Mark, Lucy, and James, found themselves driving down Black Hollow Lane. After their car broke down, they were on their way to a cabin for a weekend getaway. But the storm had turned the dirt roads into muddy traps, and the mansion was the only shelter in sight. "Are you sure about this?" Lucy asked, hesitating as they approached the rusted iron gates. "What choice do we have?" Mark replied, shaking his head. "We can't just sit in the car all night." Eleanor pushed open the gate, which groaned like a dying thing, and the group trudged up the overgrown path to the front door. The storm was relentless, and by the time they reached the porch, they were soaked to the bone. The door opened with an ominous creak, revealing a grand foyer, lit dimly by a massive crystal chandelier. To their surprise, the interior of the house was pristine, untouched by the decay they had expected. The furniture was polished, the rugs were clean, and the faint scent of roses lingered in the air. "This place doesn't look abandoned," James muttered, his voice uneasy. "Maybe someone still lives here," Eleanor suggested, though the absence of any modern touches made her doubt her own words. As they explored, they found the house unsettlingly perfect. Every room was immaculate, as though frozen in time. There were no cobwebs, no dust, nothing to indicate the mansion had been empty for a century. Then they found the portraits. Lining the main hallway were massive oil paintings of the Reinhardt family. There was the patriarch, Victor Reinhardt, with cold, calculating eyes, his wife, Eleanor, whose serene smile seemed to hide secrets, and their two children, Clara and Edgar, who looked almost too perfect, their painted faces eerily lifelike. "What's with their eyes?" Lucy asked, leaning closer to Clara's portrait. ... "Yeah," Mark agreed, shivering. "It's like they're watching us." James laughed nervously. "It's just good artistry. Let's keep moving." They decided to stay the night in the mansion, reasoning that it was better than braving the storm. But as darkness fell, the house began to change. It started with the whispers. Eleanor was the first to hear them as she lay in bed. They were faint, like distant voices carried by the wind, but unmistakable. She sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. "Eleanor." Her name echoed faintly, coming from the hallway. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out of the room. The hallway was empty, the portraits looming in the dim light. But something was different. The eyes of the Reinhardt family were glowing faintly, and their heads had turned to follow her. Panicking, she ran to wake the others. "It's the house," she whispered frantically as she shook Mark awake. "It's alive." Mark groaned, but sat up, his irritation fading when he saw the terror on her face. "What happened?" he asked. Before she could answer, a loud bang echoed through the house. They gathered Lucy and James and crept downstairs to investigate. The chandelier in the foyer was swinging wildly, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "Maybe it's just the storm," Lucy offered, though her voice trembled. Then they saw a figure standing at the base of the staircase. It was Clara Reinhardt, but not as she had appeared in her portrait. Her skin was gray and cracked, her eyes hollow and glowing faintly. She pointed a skeletal hand at them, her mouth opening wide in a silent scream. The group bolted, running blindly through the mansion. The hallways seemed to twist and shift, leading them in circles. Doors slammed shut behind them, and the whispers grew louder, forming chilling words. You shouldn't have come. Finally, they stumbled into a room that wasn't on the map they'd made of the house. It was a grand parlor, its walls lined with mirrors. In the center of the room was a massive, ornate clock, its hands spinning backward. "What is this place?" James asked, his voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, the mirrors began to shimmer. Shadows moved within them, forming shapes that resembled the Reinhardt family. The reflections stepped out of the mirrors, their forms solidifying. Victor Reinhardt towered over them, his eyes blazing with malice. "You've entered our home," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "And now you will stay." Finally, the last mirror shattered, and the room exploded in a blinding light. When the group opened their eyes, they were outside the mansion, standing in the muddy driveway. The storm had passed, and the house was silent. They didn't speak as they climbed into their car and drove away. The next day, they returned with the police, but the mansion was gone. In its place was an empty field, as if the house had never existed. But sometimes, on stormy nights, travelers claimed to see a faint light in the distance at the end of Black Hollow Lane. And if you listen closely, you can hear whispers carried by the wind, calling for someone to come back and never leave. The room seemed to close in on them. The mirrors became windows to an endless void, and the floor shifted beneath their feet. Eleanor grabbed a candelabra and swung it at the nearest mirror. The glass shattered, and the shadow figures recoiled. "Break them all," she shouted. The others followed her lead, smashing the mirrors one by one. With each mirror destroyed, the room began to tremble, and the shadows faded. Story 7. The lighthouse at Raven's Point, on a jagged cliff, overlooking the stormy waters of the North Atlantic, stood the Raven's Point lighthouse. Its once bright white paint had faded to a sickly gray, and the light atop the tower hadn't shone in decades. The locals avoided it, calling it cursed. They told stories of the last keeper, a man named Henry Vale, who had vanished one fateful night without a trace. Despite the warnings, a group of paranormal investigators, led by a skeptic named Daniel and his team Margaret, Ethan and Chloe, decided to explore the lighthouse. They had heard the tales, ghostly whispers carried by the wind, the sound of footsteps on the spiral staircase, and the eerie glow that sometimes emanated from the tower on moonless nights. "It's just an old lighthouse," Daniel had said confidently as they made their way up the rocky path. "There's no such thing as ghosts." The group reached the lighthouse as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was heavy with the salty temps of the sea, and the cries of distant seabirds faded into an unsettling silence. The door creaked open, revealing a circular room filled with dust-covered furniture and nautical equipment. A spiral staircase wound its way up the center of the structure, disappearing into the darkness above. "This place is incredible," Margaret said, setting up her camera. "It's like stepping into a time capsule." Ethan, the tech expert, began unpacking the EMF meters and thermal cameras. Chloe, the medium of the group, stood quietly, her expression grim. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked. "There's something heavy here," Chloe whispered. "It feels like the air is pressing down on me." "We're not alone." Daniel rolled his eyes. That's the whole point, isn't it? To prove whether or not this place is haunted. As the team set up their equipment, strange things began to happen. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath misting in the air. The EMF meters spiked wildly, and faint whispers echoed through the room. Though no one could make out the words, Ethan pointed the thermal camera at the staircase. "There's something up there," he said, showing the screen. A faint humanoid heat signature stood at the top of the stairs. The group exchanged uneasy glances before Daniel grabbed a flashlight. "Let's check it out," he said, leading the way. The staircase groaned under their weight as they ascended. The higher they climbed, the colder it became. When they reached the top, they found the lantern room. Its glass windows shattered and the ancient light mechanism rusted and broken. But the room wasn't empty. A figure stood by the edge of the room, silhouetted against the dark sky. It was a man in a tattered lighthouse keeper's uniform. His face was obscured, but his posture was rigid. His head tilted as though listening to something. "Henry Vale," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, revealing hollow eye sockets that seemed to pull the very light from the room. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a deep, guttural wail erupted, shaking the walls of the lighthouse. The team bolted down the stairs, the wail following them like a physical force. The air grew thick, and the staircase seemed to stretch endlessly. "Keep moving," Daniel shouted as the lantern room above erupted into a blinding light. They finally reached the base and burst out the door, collapsing onto the rocky ground outside. The lighthouse stood silent and dark once more, as if nothing had happened. "Did you get that on camera?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky. Margaret checked her equipment, but all the footage was corrupted, the screens showing nothing but static. Chloe stared at the lighthouse, her face pale. "He's still in there," she said, "and he's not alone." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. "Henry wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. The lighthouse, it takes people, traps them." As the team packed their gear and hurried back to their car, they noticed something chilling. The light at the top of the tower flickered to life, sweeping the cliffside and sea, and for a brief moment, they saw figures standing in the windows of the lighthouse, more than one, their faces pressed against the glass, watching them leave. No one spoke on the drive back to town, but they all knew one thing: Ravens Point Lighthouse wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was always searching for its next keeper. Story 8. The Shadows of Ashford House. Ashford House had stood abandoned for over a century. Its towering spires and intricate stonework once symbolized wealth and power, but now it was a decaying relic. The mansion was shrouded in mystery, its windows dark and lifeless, and the gates rusted shut as if keeping something inside. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the house, warning visitors to steer clear. They said that whoever entered Ashford House never left the Samand. Some didn't leave at all. There were many stories about the house, but the most chilling one was that of the Ashford family itself. The family had been wealthy landowners, known for their extravagant parties and social status. But everything changed when the youngest Ashford child, a girl named Isabel, disappeared without a trace one cold winter night. Her disappearance was never solved, and soon after, the family began to fall apart. The mansion, once full of life and laughter, was abandoned as the years passed, and the Ashfords were never seen again. Many believed that Isabel's spirit had never left the house, that she was still searching for something or someone. Enter Sarah and her friends, Tom Rachel, and Ben. They were urban explorers, fascinated by abandoned buildings and the stories they held. When they heard about Ashford House, they decided to spend the night inside, armed with cameras and a sense of adventure. They had heard the rumors, of course, but they didn't believe in ghosts. They were there for one thing proven. The group arrived at the front gates just as dusk began to fall. The mansion loomed before them, its shadow stretching across the landscape. The air was unnaturally still, and despite the mild temperature outside, a shiver ran down Sarah's spine as they pushed open the gate. It creaked loudly, as if protesting their intrusion, but they brushed it off. "Here we are," Tom said, grinning as he adjusted his backpack. "Let's get this over with." The front door was surprisingly easy to open, its old hinges groaning as they stepped inside. The house was a maze of dark corridors and grand rooms, all covered in dust and cobwebs. The furniture was still in place, though aged and decaying. It was as though the family had simply walked out one day and never returned. "I'll set up the camera in the dining room," Rachel said, moving off to one side. "I'll check out the library," Ben added, heading toward the back of the house. Sarah and Tom decided to explore the upper floors. The stairs creaked under their weight as they made their way up to the second level. The hallway stretched long and dark before them, each door leading to a room lost to time. The smell of mildew and decay lingered in the air, but it wasn't enough to deter them. They decided to start with the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as they pushed it open, a cold wind swept past them, making Sarah's skin crawl. The room looked as though it had been abandoned in haste. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and old, and the furniture was coated in a thick layer of dust. But what caught Sarah's attention was the painting on the wall. It was a portrait of a young girl, dressed in an old-fashioned gown with long, dark hair that framed her face. Her eyes were bright, almost too bright, and her smile was unsettling, too wide, too perfect. There was something about the girl's expression that sent a wave of unease through Sarah, but she couldn't quite place it. "Who's this?" Tom asked, peering over her shoulder. "That's Isabel Ashford," Sarah said, recognizing the name from the stories. "She disappeared here, they say. The last time anyone saw her was the night of that storm." Suddenly, the room grew colder. Sarah felt a shift in the atmosphere, and she glanced at Tom, who was staring at the painting with wide eyes. Something was wrong. The air thickened, and Sarah swore she could hear faint whispers, like voices just out of reach. Her heart began to race as the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Tom," she started, but he didn't respond. He was fixated on the painting, his eyes now wide and unblinking. "Tom," she shouted, grabbing his arm. He turned to her, his face pale. "Sarah, she's looking at me." Sarah spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The painting Isabel's eyes were no longer staring directly at her. They had shifted, now locked on Tom, her painted smile twisting into something far darker. "Get out, now," Sarah screamed. They bolted from the room, rushing down the hallway and back toward the stairs. But as they descended, the house seemed to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with every step. The faint whispers were now a chorus of voices, all calling their names, urging them to stop, to stay. They reached the bottom of the stairs and ran down the dark corridor toward the front door. But when they reached it, they found it locked. Panic surged as Sarah yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Ben, Rachel," Tom shouted, banging on the door. "Get us out of here." But there was no answer. The house was alive with the whispers, with the presence of something ancient and angry. The temperature dropped again, and Sarah felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, of something closing in on them from the shadows. She turned to Tom, her heart racing in her chest. "Isabel," she whispered, and then, as if in answer, the lights in the hallway flickered on and off. Shadows twisted and danced across the walls, and the whispers grew louder until they were deafening. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision, and she turned to see a figure standing in the dark doorway, a young girl in a long, flowing dress, her pale face twisted in a cruel smile. "Leave this place," the figure whispered, its voice a blend of childlike innocence and malice, "or become part of it." The ground beneath them seemed to tremble as the house began to shift, the walls closing in, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The figure took a step forward, her eyes glowing in the darkness. "Isabel," Sarah whispered, realizing the truth. The house had never let her go. Isabel Ashford had never left Hollow Creek Manor. She was trapped within the walls, her spirit bound to the mansion, and she wanted company. The last thing Sarah saw before everything went black was Isabel's face, twisted into a grin that was both terrifying and mournful. And then the whispers stopped. The house fell silent. The next day, the villagers found the house empty. No one had seen Sarah, Tom, or the others leave. The doors were locked, the windows dark, but if you listened carefully on a quiet night, you could hear the faintest whispers on the wind, calling out for someone to join them in the shadows of Ashford House. Story 9. The Whistling Man. It was a quiet, sleepy town, the kind where everyone knew each other's name and life moved at a slow pace. But something strange had begun to happen. Every night, around 3 a.m., the townspeople began to hear the faintest whistling sounds, eerie and distant. It was a tune that no one recognized, yet it seemed to seep into the bones of those who heard it, sending chills down their spines. At first, the sound was dismissed as just another oddity of the town, perhaps the wind or a dog howling at the moon. But soon, the whistling grew louder, more persistent. The townspeople couldn't ignore it anymore. It started to invade their dreams, disturbing their sleep. Those who lived closest to the woods, where the sound was strongest, said they saw a figure, tall and thin, with dark clothes, standing at the edge of the trees, whistling. No one knew who he was or where he had come from. The figure was a man, but there was something wrong about him. His face was always obscured by shadows, and his movements were too stiff, too deliberate. Every time someone tried to approach him, he would vanish like smoke in the wind, leaving behind only the faintest trace of that haunting tune. One evening, a young woman named Claire, newly arrived in town, decided she couldn't live with the mystery any longer. She had heard the whispers of the whistling man, but she didn't believe in superstition. She would find out who he was and put an end to the fear that had settled over the town. The next night, she sat by her window, waiting, listening. The clock struck 3 a.m., and there it was, the soft, eerie whistling. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew, becoming clearer, more distinct. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, but she was determined. She grabbed her flashlight, slipped on her boots, and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, and the trees around the house groaned in the wind. She followed the sound, moving toward the woods, her breath visible in the night air. As she walked, the whistling seemed to guide her, drawing her deeper into the forest. Her flashlight flickered in the darkness, but she kept going, knowing she was close. Then she saw him. The man was standing at the edge of the trees, his back to her. His clothes were tattered, his body unnaturally thin. But the most unsettling part was his face, or rather the lack of it. Where his face should have been was a smooth, featureless surface, as though the skin had been erased completely, leaving only a blank, pale void. The sound of the whistling grew louder, filling the air like a melody that had been stuck in time. Claire froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She had heard the stories, but seeing the man in person, standing before her, was something she could not have prepared for. Suddenly, the whistling stopped. The figure turned to face her, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. He smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. His mouth stretched too wide, too unnaturally, as if the skin on his face had been pulled back, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Why are you here?" His voice was low, almost a growl, as though it came from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man stepped closer, his movements jerky, like a marionette on invisible strings. He reached out a long, bony hand and touched her cheek, his fingers cold and clammy against her skin. His eyes, if they could even be called, that glowed faintly in the darkness. Hollow pits that seemed to pull her in, drawing her closer. "You shouldn't have come," the whistling man whispered, his voice now a cold hiss. "You're mine now." Without warning, Claire felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She tried to pull away, but her feet felt like they were stuck in the earth, as though the ground itself was holding her in place. The man's smile widened even further, and he tilted his head, studying her with that strange, empty gaze. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees shifting and bending, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Claire tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the night. The last thing she saw was the man's mouth opening wide, impossibly wide, as he leaned forward to whisper one last word in her ear: "Mine." The next morning, Claire's body was found at the edge of the woods, pale and lifeless, her face frozen in an expression of terror. There was no sign of the whistling man, no trace of him at all, but the whistling continued. Every night, the tune filled the air, just as it had before, and now, when people heard it, they knew the whistling man was always near. He was never far from the edge of the trees, watching, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. And every time someone ventured into the woods, they felt his presence, the cold chill of his touch, the emptiness of his face. The whistling would start, drawing them in, until there was nothing left but silence. Claire had been the last to disappear, but she wouldn't be the last to hear the tune. If you listen closely enough, you might hear it too. A soft whistle carried on the wind, drifting through the trees. And if you followed it just like Claire did, you might find yourself standing in the woods, staring at the figure in the distance. His mouth stretched into that wide, terrible grin, and then, like so many before you, you'll be his forever lost to the whistling man. Story 10. The Old Man's Warning. Lena had always been a curious soul, and when she heard about the old mansion at the edge of town, she couldn't resist. The mansion had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, its tall iron gates rusted and its windows boarded up. But the stories surrounding it were what truly intrigued her. People said that the mansion was cursed, that anyone who went inside would never return the same. Locals whispered that the previous owners had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the house was abandoned soon after. But that was all just folklore, right? One foggy afternoon, after hearing yet another version of the story at the local bar, Lena decided to find out for herself. She gathered a few friends, Jake, Max, and Soviet. Together, they made their way toward the mansion. The heavy iron gates creaked as they pushed them open, their footsteps sinking into the damp earth. The mansion loomed ahead, casting long shadows in the gray light. The windows were cracked, the door slightly ajar, as if inviting them in, despite their reservations. Lena led the group toward the house, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the silence was suffocating. The grand staircase twisted upwards, covered in a carpet of decay. Portraits of long-forgotten faces lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow every movement. The walls themselves seemed to whisper, as though they held secrets they were dying to tell. The group explored room by room, but every door they opened led to more shadows and decay. The house felt alive, like it was watching them, waiting for something. At the end of a long corridor, they found an old study-its wooden, shelves lined with tattered books and papers covered in strange symbols. In the corner sat a rocking chair, moving gently as though it had been disturbed recently. The only light came from the flickering flames of a dying fire. "That's strange," Sophie said, glancing at the chair. "There's no breeze in here. It shouldn't be moving." Before anyone could answer, a creaking sound echoed through the hall, followed by the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone or something approaching them. Lena's heart stopped. Her friends seemed frozen in place as the steps grew louder, closer. She turned to look down the hallway, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, like someone walking through the darkness toward them. Max, trying to remain brave, reached for the door handle to leave, but it slammed shut on its own, trapping them inside. A low voice, raspy and distant, echoed from the walls, sending chills down their spines. "Leave now, or you will never leave." Lena's blood ran cold. She turned to her friends, but they were already looking panicked, eyes wide with terror. Sophie's hand was trembling as she clutched Lena's sleeve. Who said that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Lena spun around, but there was nothing there, just darkness. But the presence was undeniable. It was as though the house itself was alive, hungry for them. Suddenly, the door burst open, and standing in the doorway was an old man, his face pale and wrinkled with age. His eyes were wild, his clothes torn, as if he had been trapped in the mansion for years. "Get out!" the old man screamed, his voice frantic. "You don't understand. It's awake. It's waiting for you." Before they could react, he grabbed Lena by the arm, his cold fingers digging into her skin. "Leave before it takes you to." He pulled her toward the door, but the house groaned, its walls shifting as if trying to hold them inside. With a terrifying jolt, the floor beneath their feet shook, and the walls began to pulse like a heartbeat. "Don't listen to him," a voice hissed from the darkness, low and guttural. "You're already too late." Lena turned to see the old man's terrified expression shift into something unrecognizable. His eyes widened in horror as his body started to twist and contort, his skin cracking like brittle paper. With a final blood-curdling scream, his body collapsed into a heap of dust and bones, leaving only the echo of his scream lingering in the air. The house was silent again, but the atmosphere had changed. The walls now seemed alive, vibrating with a dark energy. The whispers were everywhere, inside their heads, clawing at their sound. Max, Sophie, and Jake were paralyzed with fear, but Lena, terrified and confused, knew they had no choice but to leave. She reached for the door, but as her hand touched the knob, she felt something cold brush against her neck. She turned, but nothing was there. The whispers grew louder, and then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Lena could feel the pressure around them growing, as though the house was drawing them in, tightening its grip. With one final, desperate push, Lena yanked the door open, and they stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. But as they looked back, the mansion seemed to shift. The windows, once boarded up, now glowed with an eerie light, and the doors stood wide open, waiting for the next curious souls to wander in. Lena glanced at her friends, and for the first time, she realized something. The house had marked them. The whispers were not just in the walls, they were inside their heads, now, forever, and they would never escape.